Peter Underwood, and this is News from the Water, except that I'm taking a holiday and this is more of an opinion from the water. Now and again I'm asked, so what's your solution when the ineptitude and untrustworthiness of the Canal and River Trust is demonstrated yet again by a boater or often a whistleblower from within the trust itself? My usual, I must admit, somewhat glib answer is that I wouldn't start from here. And the truth is that boaters, including myself, were telling anyone who would listen nearly 15 years ago that David Cameron's experiment in offloading responsibility for non-productive functions from the government's books was not motivated by any love of the UK's waterways. This supposedly clever idea of creating a dubious charity company to operate the British waterways, and soon we were promised the Environment Agency's waters, if all went to plan, was flawed from the start, and those boaters objecting to the idea had no doubts that the end result would be a system in decline leading to failure. That charity, created by Cameron, depended on continued government funding on a substantial scale, passing over a substantial legacy of publicly owned assets to provide investment income as well. The grand theory of this third sector way was that charitable income would grow almost exponentially to replace the millions in government grants. In vain, we pointed out that there was unlikely to be any public desire to fund what many saw as muddy ditches, and that was just those that had worked out they lived near the cut. We were right, of course. In vain, we suggested that as soon as the government stopped paying out to the proposed charity, it would collapse. And our concept that this was a major national asset, that the whole system should be given World Heritage status for its key role in the Industrial Revolution and should be cared for by government for the British people, went unheard. Eventually, we had to accept that Cameron wasn't going to abandon his pet project of hiving off public assets and responsibilities into a pseudo-charity. So we tried to ameliorate the impact. A disparate group of boaters established an umbrella group called Boaters Manifesto. And looking back at it now, the demands it made have been echoing, unanswered, down the past dozen years. That manifesto asked for more boaters at the top level of CRT. There are none. It warned that the trustees should be sure they have enough money from the government to keep all the waterways open, navigable and properly maintained before they accepted the government's deal. They didn't. The manifesto asked that Canal and River Trust shouldn't simply be British waterways with the new hat on, and that the senior management of British waterways should go. They stayed. We failed too to persuade the trustees that Canal and River Trust must develop a system of working that values full-time paid staff and their skills above the expediency of using cheap contractors in order to maintain the skilled workforce the waterways require. Now, most are gone. Today, almost the only people working on our waterways are contractors and volunteers. We wanted to ensure non-boating users of the system made a financial contribution to its upkeep, and that their use of the system didn't impinge on its primary purpose of navigation. Another failure. We were insistent that CRT must be open to Freedom of Information Act requests and operate in a totally transparent fashion. We insisted in vain, and today we watch helplessly as they change legally protected information with apparent impunity and ignore any attempts to bring them to book. Way back then, we told the trustees that canals without boats don't last very long for other users, as there's no longer a reason to keep the unique industrial heritage in working order, that the structures will crumble, the water silt up, and little be left. Waterways need boats as much as boats need waterways. We said boaters need to be assured that all existing navigations are sufficiently well maintained to enable the vessels designed to use them to travel the whole length of those waterways at all times of the year, and to operate the locks and other equipment with relative ease and safety. Now, with hindsight, that amounts to fortune telling. We insisted that the waterways mustn't be allowed to deteriorate through lack of maintenance, and that the Canal and River Trust must have sufficient contingency funds to deal with a major breach without delay. Once again, we failed, and we now see many stoppages as the historic infrastructure is not looked after as it should be. Our concern back then was because the financial projections offered by British Waterways and DEFRA were simply wrong, as they didn't model the true cost of creating a well-maintained system. We were concerned that the British Waterways workforce had already become disconnected from the system it served, thanks to those early attempts to farm out much of the bankside and construction work to the cheapest available contractors. And we wanted to see visible individuals responsible for a particular stretch of waterway with clear responsibilities and accountability in the event of failures. We believed then that the skills of the workforce should be valued, encouraged and passed on, especially as caring for a 200-year-old set of artefacts requires special expertise. We wanted to see work brought back in-house and apprenticeships encouraged, along the lines of those provided by the National Trust. As you can see, we failed, or rather, Canal and River Trust and its trustees failed to listen. That was then, and this is now. I know I've recently been going over this same ground in an online discussion with a boater called David Evans from Ludlow, and he started out with the same worry that concerned many boaters back at the start of CRT, that if the Trust doesn't have enough money, will it hike licence fees? Well, it sort of did and it didn't. It held them for a while, but I don't think that CRT is currently short of money, although it will be if its gamble that the government will back its well-being agenda fails. And what is now required is an adjustment of spending priorities so that CRT does its job properly. That's its prime job of looking after navigations. That should come before all the fluffy toys and expensive videos. But it should also come before lining the pockets of big contractors. Now, David wanted to know if I thought CRT could do more with a direct labour force, and I've no doubt that lots more would get done, but more importantly, the entire organisation would be refocused back onto the navigation. The fake economics of the Thatcher era insisted that private contractors were, by definition, better value. That, of course, is because there's no attempt to quantify the value of experience, effective teamwork, and because the primary objective of that philosophy was not to make things cheaper, but to allow the private sector to pillage the public sector. In reality, all contractors deliver the least amount possible for the most profit. Why wouldn't they? Rubbish collection is an obvious example, but there are many others. Now, this is multiplied when those specifying a a contract are ignorant and naive, and the result is poor, expensive service by people and businesses who have no interest in the canals and less knowledge of them. Boaters have seen the results again and again, from breach repairs which leave too little water for boats to float over the site, to failing to repair locks and facilities effectively and on time, and many more breakdowns as a result of that failure. How much better it would have been to go down the National Trust route of building skilled in-house teams to deal with what is, after all, a great national asset. Now, David believes there's an economic argument for both systems, and does point out quite rightly that some parts of the public sector have been very poor at both specifying contract terms and managing contract, leaving loopholes and get-out-of-jail cards for some contractors. And he went on to make the argument that both British Waterways and CRT have also made in the past that contractors provide a more flexible workforce and save them from tying up capital and machinery. Well, my belief is that not having the equipment or people puts CRT at the mercy of contractors, as we've seen with long delays for repairs, and it's something that much of British industry is now discovering in relation to lorry drivers and other gig economy roles staffed by so-called facility companies. In reality, CRT doesn't need a flexible workforce. It has the same tasks every year, and it should be investing in the skills and equipment to do its core job properly. A properly run, trained and incentivised set of in-house teams would deliver more and better results for the same money. But of course it would require senior management willing and capable of running such a team. David still thinks there isn't enough money to do the work requires, and he wants me to offer a solution to the very problem I was spelling out to British Waterways and the CRT trustees more than a decade earlier. Well, okay, when it comes to money, I have a simple approach. CRT was created by Cameron as an experiment, potentially a way to get an expensive national obligation off the government's books. Looking at CRT, it's clearly a failed experiment. In my view, our historic waterways are a massive national asset and should, in their entirety, be designated a World Heritage Site. That will focus the need for public responsibility and funds for the waterways on the basis that they benefit a large proportion of the country in various ways and are worthy of public money. To some extent, that's happening anyway, because the government's continued to fund the waterways to the tune of millions of pounds for the last 12 years. But CRT gets in the way. If you ask how the waterways should be funded, the answer is how it's already funded, with public money and the income from public assets. What needs to change is the removal of this fake charity, a switch away from the expensive contractors, and a campaign to persuade government to pay a bit more and keep paying it in order to preserve and maintain something this nation should value enormously. Not to do so would be criminal negligence of one of this country's greatest assets. But of course, I have to accept this particular government is largely impervious to the common sense of that. Canal and River Trust has indeed transformed British waterways, but not in a good way. It's no longer prioritising spending on the navigations which are entrusted to its care, but on a desperate attempt to persuade the government to continue funding the trust on a large scale, because doing so is good for the well-being of the public as a whole. You know, from the perspective of one of the people who predicted this very predicament a dozen years ago, there's little satisfaction in saying we told you so, but we bloody did. Next week, a look towards the future.
We need video and photos of all aspects of the waterways. Email files to peterunderwood2@gmail.com with your name and a brief description of it and where and when it was shot.